and we are so excited to welcome you to our first event of the semester. Today's event is focused on foreign policy priorities for the incoming Trump administration. And before I introduce our great speakers and moderator today, I want to tell you a little bit about what inspired today's event, which is a series of papers by Perry Worldhouse affiliated scholars and visitors focused on recommendations for the new administration. There's a lot of interest, obviously, in the world, on campus, in Philadelphia, about what the second Trump term is going to look like from a national security and foreign policy perspective. And Perry Worldhouse, as the university's hub for global policy engagement, is uniquely positioned to provide insight and guidance on foreign policy and national security issues, given that our work is at the nexus of academia and public policy. We have faculty from around the world who study the world, and we have visitors that include former U.S. foreign policy and national security leaders, including some that you'll hear from today, UN officials, representatives from governments around the world, other academics, et cetera. To move the conversation forward, we've put together a series of papers on some of the biggest issues facing the administration to try to understand and make recommendations to the incoming Trump administration on key policy choices. So with that out of the way, and you can find those on our website throughout the week, along with an introduction that I'll be writing. Now to the main event. Very happy to introduce four terrific speakers and a moderator that will make us all much smarter about the foreign policy of Trump's second term. They'll have a conversation, and then we'll turn to you in the audience, both in person and online, for questions. If you're in person and you have a question, someone will come around to you with a microphone. If you're watching online, please ask a question through the Q&A interface in Zoom. I'm going to introduce all our speakers, get off the stage, and then they'll come on and get started. First, we have Sasha Baker, who's a visiting fellow with us here at Perry Worldhouse. She works on national security policy for OpenAI. She's the former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Pentagon and my former boss. Our second panelist is Hus Banai, who's also a visiting fellow at Perry Worldhouse, an associate professor of international studies at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. Our third panelist is Aaron Sikorsky, a former visiting fellow and friend of Worldhouse, who's the director of the Center for Climate Change and Security. And finally, we have Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, who's a non-resident senior advisor at Worldhouse, a distinguished fellow at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security and the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. And last but certainly not least, we are really honored to have a tremendous moderator, Justin Vogt, who's the executive editor of Foreign Affairs. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming our panelists to the stage and online, and I hope you have a great event. Thanks.
So I will say that when I think back to 2016, oh, there we go. Now I'm really an expert. In 2016, it was a surprise. To most people, came as a surprise. There was a similar sense of what's going to happen. One thing that, a sort of note of optimism that I'll put into this, and I hope that our distinguished panelists sort of agree with me about this. One of the productive things I found back in 2016 and 17 was that talking about foreign policy in the Trump era, you're forced to kind of go back to sort of what I would call first order questions. You can't assume that much. It's an unpredictable president. There's a kind of factional rivalry. And there's this quality of disruption. Trump is a disruptive character and a disruptive president. And so what it forces you to do, especially if you spend a lot of time in the weeds of policies, to think, well, now what's the real question here? What's the big question? What do we really know? What's kind of just conventional wisdom that people kind of say, blah, 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 and how can we separate those two and get real answers? That's what we're going to try to do today. We've got a great panel. I'm going to start I'm going to ask a question of each of them. I might follow up, and then we're going to open it up about halfway through to the audience. So I wanted to start with Sandy because I think that when I look at what the threats and the challenges that the administration is coming in, the one that seems most pressing or most pointed, partially because of Trump's own rhetoric, is the war in Ukraine. I want to ask you, what do you think? You know, Trump has said that he's going to solve the war. First, he said in 24 hours, I think, during the campaign. Recently, I noticed that he was interviewed. He said, "Well, I might need 6 months." So sort of classic, Trump weave. But what do you think he will do? What do you think is most likely that he's going to do to try to end the war? And then I want to ask you, because I'm going to assume that you don't think that's what he should do, and so I want to know what you think he should do.
Thanks very much, Justin. I agree that this is probably the issue that's going to get the most immediate attention by the new administration, and it deserves high priority attention as well. Yes, Trump has given himself 6 months, although his Ukraine-Russia envoy, Keith Kellogg, has just brought back to 100 days. So we'll see who wins that race. But clearly, it's going to be kind of a bellwether of how this administration's foreign policy is going to be carried out. And some basic choices are before Trump, and he hasn't given very clear hints as to which direction he's going to go. I personally believe it's still more likely, despite some of the hints of a serious approach to negotiations, that Trump will most likely throw Ukraine under the bus. I think that even though it's a country that's been heroically fighting for its independence, I think Trump still kind of is sympathetic to the MAGA Republicans who declared that it's a waste of money, that Ukraine can't win, it's our fault. I mean, there's all kinds of opinions on the MAGA side. So, but whatever Trump does, it will set the tone for a lot of his foreign policy. The other basic option is to continue to back Ukraine and try to kind of create some kind of improved conditions for a decent outcome for Ukraine. That's what I would like to see, but it's hard to be optimistic in that regard. As I said, I think the most likely scenario is the first one I mentioned, that ostensibly to end the killing and stop wasting money on another forever war. Trump will press President Zelensky to agree to an early ceasefire, essentially along current battle lines. And that's clearly what the Russians are anticipating. And they're kind of salivating, waiting to engage with Trump. And they think that he's going to be fairly easy on them. And I fear he's right. An early ceasefire in place would temporarily end the fighting, but it would leave Russian occupation troops in significant parts of Ukraine. And it would essentially create a pause during which the Russians could reconstitute their forces in preparation for a renewed attack on Ukraine, maybe as early as later this year. So this would not be a particularly good outcome. I think that what I'm hoping, against my expectations, is that some of the more pro-Ukraine advisors within his team, including the National Security Advisor, Waltz, and Marco Rubio. We don't know where Hegseth stands on anything policy related, but we shall see. But hopefully they will kind of point out that selling Ukraine out, cutting off aid, pressuring them to accept a bad deal would not only be bad for U.S. security, in the sense that it would give Putin a sort of sense that he has now a green light to pursue other imperialistic designs to attack other former Soviet republics. And I think that is clearly his long-term agenda. So I think they want to point out that whether you care about the rules-based international order or not, fact is that you will be portrayed as a loser. And this, anything
Which Trump hates, that would be anathema to him.
The thing he hates most is to be treated as a loser. So what I hope will happen is that they will kind of make the case that we shouldn't rush into this negotiation. There's obviously a lot of anticipation among our allies, who I think are convinced that there may be a case for at least de-escalating this war, even if a permanent solution may be out of reach for a while. But pursuing a more realistic approach, and I would say doing sort of some kind of ultimatum to the Russians. This will be the hardest sell to Trump, to basically tell Putin, we're going to massively escalate the military aid to Ukraine if you don't agree to something more balanced, something that would at least not be a humiliating defeat for Ukraine.
Do you think if there are some advisors to Trump that could actually convince him to do that, that seems to me it would cause a political risk for him with his base and his support here. Do you feel that his grip is strong enough that he'd be able to kind of bring people on board?
I do. I think that there are still plenty of pro-Ukrainian members of the Republican Party. The ones who made all the trouble last year with the blocking the supplemental, which unfortunately Trump acquiesced in or even pushed for. But I think that they're still kind of looking for openings to recommend something that would basically, make Putin an offer he can't refuse, face the danger of a massive escalation and further losses. And the Russians are hurting. They're not doing as well on the battlefield as they would like you to believe. But possibly if we rally our allies, can increase the amount of aid, stop self-constraining a lot of the high-tech weapons that the Ukrainians desperately need to put the Russians on their back foot, it could create a more favorable situation for a deal.
Maximum pressure on Russia, basically.
Maximum pressure.
Let me use that. Actually, I want to pivot to Huss, because that term, of course, comes from his first term, his Trump's Iran policy of maximum pressure. I want to read to you something that Richard Haass, who is the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, wrote in Foreign Affairs recently. He wrote this piece called The Iran Opportunity, and he started by saying, it's hard to think of a country that has lost as much influence in as short a time as has Iran. Until recently, it was arguably the most important regional actor in the Middle East, more influential than Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, or Turkey. Yet in a matter of months, the edifice of Iranian influence has come crashing down. Iran is weaker, more vulnerable than it has been in decades, likely since its decade-long war with Iraq, or even since the 1979 revolution. Clearly an extraordinary turn of events. First of all, do you agree with that assessment? And then the question I have for you is, if Iran has become so much weaker, does that mean it's more likely to become more conciliatory or more aggressive, and why?
Well, that's an excellent question. I fully agree with that assessment, that in a span of just 3 to 5 months, we have an entirely different geopolitical situation in which one of the key antagonists in the Middle East, a key obstacle to many of the interests that the United States ordinarily would want to secure in the Middle East, is at its weakest moment, probably since the end of the Iran-Iraq War in 1989. But I would go actually farther back, probably to the inception of the Islamic Republic in 1979. But what's also unique in this moment is that we have this remarkable period in geopolitics where the same president is now facing a country that has been handed to him quite boxed in at the beginning of his term. In 2017, Trump comes into office. Iran's nuclear program has been put under verifiable checks as a part of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action Iran nuclear deal that the United States led in negotiating that deal with the permanent 5 countries of the UN Security Council, and plus Germany. And Iran was fairly boxed in, and Trump came in and unboxed Iran, and in fact set in motion this kind of menacing force that we saw play out across the Middle East from that point on. Iran was the one country that the Trump administration targeted. It assassinated Iran's most senior general, Qasem Soleimani, head of the elite Quds force of the IRGC, Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. and really sent a signal to Iran that it needs to fortify its proxies and client states from Iraq to Syria to Lebanon, that really presented a major national security challenge to Israel, especially. But what we've seen since October 7, 2023, since the Hamas attacks on Israel, is that the Israeli intelligence has really gone to work and picked Iran's lock and has been able to remarkably roll back Iranian influence that really culminated in the fall of the Assad regime. Now, I'm not saying that Israel had engineered the fall of the Assad regime, but certainly having infiltrated Iranian national security elite to such an extent where Israel was able to not only understand the movements of high-profile foreign guests such as Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas in Tehran, to be able to assassinate him inside Iran, inside a heavily guarded Revolutionary Guards compound, to be able to penetrate Iranian air defenses. Israeli jets flew in the skirmishes back and forth between Iran and Israel. Iranian weakness is not only a matter of it losing client states and proxies in the region, but also having been exposed to the world as a country whose internal decision-making and strategic considerations is very well known to Israeli intelligence and American intelligence by extension in advance.
And how do you expect a regime like this to react to that sort of exposure?
Well, we see them very confused, very paranoid. There were reports of senior commands of the Revolutionary Guards being under surveillance. Maybe the head of Iranian intelligence himself being a Mossad spy.
Whoops.
You have a country that is really figured out by its number one foe. Now, we don't know all the details of how much the Israelis know, how much the United States has had a role to play in this as well. But it is absolutely clear that the Trump administration, as it takes office, has it faces an Iran that is considerably not just weaker, but exposed and very eager to reach some sort of negotiated settlement. How it plays this hand, the Trump administration, is really comes down to Washington, the court politics around the president, and who is going to have his ear. We don't know that. The uncertainty, this is remarkable, the uncertainty in the US-Iran relations in 46 years is no longer in Tehran, but in Washington, D.C. That's a massive sea change that I think is just as predictable as, you know, the president's daily whims.
I'm going to ask you one last question, which is what the other place that we're watching, obviously, is Israel. How Israel reacts is that they've been the sort of main actor in this, main external actor in this. What would you put the odds of an Israeli strike on Iranian nuclear facilities in the next 2 years?
85%.
85%.
85%. If you're Benjamin Netanyahu and you have an Iran who's at its most vulnerable you've ever confronted, you're a statesman who has made it his mission to neutralize Iran as the singular biggest national security threat to Israel, and you now have an alignment of far-right political appointees from Washington, D.C., and within your own cabinet and your own government. This is your window, but you will first wait and see how Trump approaches this. You would want ordinarily the United States to make the strategic excuse for you to go in and do something first, to maybe try get the Iranians to say no to something first. But I would imagine that the probability is much higher. Now that 15% of probably not is it still 15%? I don't want to sound like Nate Silver here, but it is still a high probability of it not happening. But if you're Benjamin Netanyahu and you get this lineup of leaders, I mean, this is your window.
Okay. All right. We're going to shift from those kind of very proximate threats, the war in Ukraine, the Iranian situation. We're going to shift now to talking about what I would call sort of longer term and maybe even like existential threats to not just U.S. national security, but maybe humanity. Aaron, not to load things too much for you, but you work on climate change, and obviously Trump's victory does not seem to augur for a new era of international cooperation on climate or emissions. He's called climate change a hoax. But obviously, if you've been watching the news this week, if you needed any reminder of just how serious and how real this threat is, you just have to look at the headlines from Los Angeles. I guess my question for you, though, is how much worse can this get? Because I for the past 4 years, we've had an administration which is putatively trying to make progress on this, but emissions are not down. There's been some kind of procedural progress. There's been some investment, but I don't know. At the end of 4 years, it's hard for me to feel like there's been a huge amount of progress on this. And it would be good to be reminded of just that, okay, maybe, but it could get a lot worse. Is that true?
Yeah, thanks, Justin.
You're welcome.
Thanks to Perry Worldhouse for hosting this. And maybe one quibble there. Climate is a long-term problem, but it's also a near-term problem, right? That our military and security services are dealing with, as you said, in Los Angeles today. I mean, and other countries too. Poland deployed its largest number of troops to deal with flood ever in a domestic deployment to deal with floods earlier this year. And you're right, globally, emissions not down. They're going up. The United States emissions have gone down, though, since 2005.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Okay.
And including about 2% last year under the Biden administration. But globally, what has also happened is emissions aren't going up at the same rate as they once were. And that actually matters a lot because every fraction of a degree of warming, right, matters for what we see from disasters, what we see from wildfires, from hurricanes, things like that. And so bending that curve is really important. If we were still under 2010 policies, for example, globally related to emissions, we'd be on a trajectory by 2030 for a lot more warming than we are now today. And that's a good thing. And that keeps Americans and our interests a lot safer. I think the challenge with the Trump administration, I mean, we're not going to be surprised, right? They're going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. They're going to step back from talking about climate change as a national security threat. If anyone watched Hegseth's hearings yesterday, he made it very clear that the Secretary of the Navy will not be focused on climate change under his watch. And I think that's a real risk for the U.S. because it gives us a blind spot, right? It creates a huge missed opportunity to understand how climate is shaping the national security landscape in such a way, shaping these threats that the other folks on the panel have talked about, because they're not separate. It's not either you deal with China or you deal with climate change, either you deal with Ukraine or you deal with climate. Climate affects your ability to deal with those other crises, right? It affects how U.S. competitors and adversaries act on the world stage, what their national interests are. It affects how our allies and partners are preparing for the future, what key countries in the Indo-Pacific want from the United States, right, in terms of partnership and support. And so if you're building a national security apparatus that can't bring that into the bring the climate picture into the conversation, you're going to miss things or get things wrong. President Biden had to cancel his last trip of his foreign visit of his term because of the fires in California. As part of that visit, he was supposed to meet with President Zelensky to talk about moving further cooperation forward on Ukraine. Similarly, when Hurricane Helene hit, he had to cancel a trip to Europe to meet with Zelensky and European partners on Ukraine. He also had to cancel a trip to Angola, where the U.S. was set to unveil a new infrastructure project that was clearly designed to compete with China and the BRI. So that's an example of a climate hazard, right? Interrupting or slowing down other foreign policy priorities. And so, there's someone who used to work on climate issues in the Pentagon who would always say to me, look, physics always wins, right? So even if this administration chooses not to prioritize climate change, climate is going to come for them in some sense.
You might not care about the climate, but the climate cares about you. Yeah.
Exactly.
Let me ask you this. There was some of the best progress I think that was made, or some of it was the Inflation Reduction Act, right? That's what people point to. Do you expect that this administration or their allies in Congress are going to try to roll that back?
I think we'll see some kind of PR focused public actions by this administration on parts of the Inflation Reduction Act. I would expect, something around electric vehicles, something like that. But I think by and large, a lot of what's in the Inflation Reduction Act is very popular in congressional districts, both blue and red, around the country, because the tax breaks and the investments and the economic development that's coming into these districts is really welcome. And we've already seen some folks, Republicans in the House, write to Speaker Johnson and say, please don't, cut some of these provisions. They're helping my district. So I don't expect we'll see a wholesale reversal. I think we'll see some kind of splashy announcements from the administration. But as you said, we can always be surprised too where these things go with Trump.
Okay. Sasha, thank you so much for doing this virtually. It's nice to see you. Before we started here, I was talking to your former deputy, Mike Horowitz, and he said he was watching the hearings yesterday, the Hegseth hearings, and he heard, when it came to innovation and automation, he actually heard some of the kind of the right buzzwords, and he said, it made him happy because at a baseline, what he wants is all the robots. So I like that line, Mike, is all the robots. I guess, what I heard Jake Sullivan was on Ezra Klein's podcast this week, and he said that one of the things he felt was a real achievement for the administration was that when they came in, the line on AI, which you work on, was that China's in the lead. China's going to win the AI race, or China is winning the AI race, and that now the consensus seems to have shifted that is no longer the case. The United States has kind of taken the lead, or is poised to take the lead. I guess what I want to know is, A, do you agree that that's true? And B, if it is true, do you think that the Trump administration has a chance to maintain that edge or grow that edge, or are you worried that it will somehow, lose it?
Yeah, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you, Justin, for moderating this, and thanks to Perry Worldhouse and to the University of Pennsylvania for putting this on. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. I'm here in Washington, D.C. As you can imagine, there's a lot going on in Washington this week as we get ready for the inauguration over the weekend and into next week. So to try to answer your question, look, I think the answer is yes and no. And Jake used to be my former boss, so far be it for me to correct him. But I think the U.S. is in the lead right now. I used to work for Ash Carter, who was famous for saying never bet against the United States, and I'm a believer in that. That being said, I think the race is closer maybe than Jake might have indicated in that particular interview. There are a number of new developments coming out of Chinese AI labs and Chinese AI companies just in the last couple of months that I think have turned some of the conventional wisdom on its head about what the PRC may be able to do with even with resource constraints, limited access to compute, et cetera. So it is very much a race in my view, and it's a race that I think we all need to be prepared to do what it takes to make sure the U.S. comes out on top. And that maybe is the second half of my answer. Sam Altman, who's the CEO at OpenAI, I should say I'm speaking in my personal capacity here today, but I'll quote Sam just for a second. He's talked about the fact that Donald Trump is likely to be the president when we reach AGI. AGI meaning artificial general intelligence, or an AI system, a model that is as smart or smarter than the smartest humans. That's going to happen at a moment of intensifying competition between the PRC and the United States, both writ large and also very narrowly in the AI space. This administration is going to have enormously consequential decisions to make about how they manage that moment. I think on a positive note, and maybe this is a little bit of what Mike was reacting to in the confirmation hearings yesterday, I think this administration is bringing in a lot of people who get that, and who have a deep background in technology and some in AI specifically, and who understand the state of the art here in a way that I think is going to be really critical. I will be honest with you, when I served in government and I had a government career of almost 2 decades, this was not on the front burner for me, even as of a year ago. I was very focused on Ukraine. I was very focused on Iran and the Middle East. I had very smart people like Mike working for me who were thinking about AI, but this was not the most urgent issue. And I think increasingly, the one quibble I'd have, Justin, with the way you sort of frame this is I actually don't think of this as a long-term issue. This is something that's coming at us in the here and now. And so when you talk to the researchers who work in the laboratory here at OpenAI or at any of our peer labs, they will tell you that they expect to have in a matter of months things that I think on the outside people think, oh, that's 10 years out. So the technology is moving so rapidly. And I think government really needs to grapple with that. So there are a couple of things, from my vantage point, I would love to see the government doing, and I think that the Trump administration will be well poised to help with. The first is investing in the infrastructure around this technology, because the fact of the matter is, whoever has the access to compute, the access to the energy that underlies it, the access to data, and the access to human capital is probably going to win. And those are areas where the government can make a really big difference. And I would love to see a bipartisan moonshot in this area. And the other area where I think there can be real progress made is frankly on partnership between industry and government, both to make sure that we're doing what we can to secure this technology, that its deployment is safe in the world. Also, that it's not subject to cyber attack or theft or IP theft from adversaries who might want to get their hands on it, but also for adoption. I think it is very possible that we could win the race to develop the most advanced and most sophisticated AI technologies and fail to implement them as fast as other countries around the world. And that's something that I worry about a lot. But it is also something that's within our control. And so these are areas where I'd love to see the next administration focus.
Can I ask you a question? This might put this. I don't mean to put you in a tough position, but you have such a good view of this because of your experience and where you said that. One thing that, as an outsider, I don't know a lot about AI, and I don't know a lot about how it's intersecting with government policy or foreign policy. But one thing that worries me a little bit is it seems to me that the private sector is really driving the train, and with the Trump administration in particular, you have the presence of all of these kind of tech investors and tech entrepreneurs. And I worry a little bit when I look at that it's the wrong way around. Do you feel like there's a way that can work and actually be better and not kind of corrupted? I don't know. I mean, does that worry you at all?
Well, look, I mean, this is an unusual moment. There's not a lot of precedent for there to be a technology that is so potentially transformative across all aspects of how we live our lives, from economic development to national security and so on, that is really exclusively owned in the private sector, that wasn't developed either in government or at least in part in collaboration with government.
Right. It's so different, say, from atomic weapons or these other transformative technologies.
Exactly. That being said, government has a lot of levers here. And, I think you described a little bit of this in talking about some of what Jake has said publicly. The Biden administration actually exercised a number of those levers in terms of putting in place an AI Safety Institute, which operates out of NIST at the Department of Commerce. We partner very closely with the AI Safety Institute to do basically safety testing on our models before they become publicly available. On some of the export controls that they've put in place on particular GPUs and chips and other pieces of infrastructure that underlie this technology. So government has a really important role to play here, and I echo what you heard maybe from some of my fellow panelists. There's some uncertainty in the environment. We don't know exactly how the Trump administration is going to choose to exercise those levers. I'm an optimist by nature, right? But I am fundamentally a little bit optimistic here because, as I said, they've made some really smart picks about who they're putting in these roles in terms of people who deeply understand the technical aspects of what we're trying to do. And I think that is, that's really putting us in a good position to start having some of these conversations.
Yeah, that's extremely reassuring. I haven't heard someone with your level of authority say that, so I'm very actually glad to hear that. Okay, why don't we open it up to questions from the audience? Just raise your hand. We have someone here with a mic, and he will deliver it. If you could just identify yourself and make sure to please ask a question of our panelists, and not make a speech. Go ahead. Let's start with the gentleman in the front here.
Just an interested citizen, but I'm curious about your take on TikTok specifically. Do you feel that the Chinese are going to mine the data that's available, and do you think that what the outcome would be of separating from the parent company?
Yeah, great. Let's Sasha. Why don't you take that one? That's in your wheelhouse. I'm curious to know what you think about that too.
Yeah. Well, look, I'll put on my former hat as someone who sat at the Pentagon and thought about these things. I don't know whether the Chinese were planning to, the CCP in particular was planning to harvest the data. I think certainly the capability was there, though, right? And for me, as someone who is interested in protecting the data of U.S. citizens, and both individually and in the aggregate, and what someone might deduce about the sort of vibes, for lack of a better word, in the national population, yeah. and then also how that can be manipulated. That is, in my view, a real vulnerability. Now, I'm not going to express an opinion about what we should do about it, whether the outcome that seems now to be increasingly likely is the right one. But is there a national security risk there? I think, from my view, yes. And I think most of my colleagues who've spent time thinking about this would probably say the same. On the other hand, I like TikTok videos just as much as everybody else, right? So it's a really challenging area for the government to navigate, no doubt.
Okay. Yeah, the young man here in the middle.
Hi, my name is Michael, a freshman at the Huntsman program here at Penn. I just had a question about the Israel-Hamas conflict. So with the ceasefire being just recently agreed in principle, what do you think is the strategy will be, maybe should be, for maintaining that ceasefire, or maybe leading it to a longer-term peace deal?
Huss, you want to take that?
Sure. Well, we have to see. I just heard that a deal was reached. I haven't looked at the particular aspects of it. It is a very stabilizing development for Israel, first and foremost, because it can set the parameters for its military operations. But more importantly, I think in terms of from the U.S. Policy perspective, the attention can now shift to what to do with Gaza, what to do with refugees, where to hold the line for where Israeli settlers might move, or plans for Israel to annex parts of northern Gaza at least. Those conversations can now form a kind of a negotiating process, not dissimilar to when the Oslo peace process first started, as to whether a two-state solution is something that's even possible to go back to or not. So it actually injects a bit of predictability in terms of where the conversation might go from here on, now that a ceasefire has been reached. Having said that, you give these things some time to see whether they hold actually, or whether they're actually set up as a pretext for further conflict down the road, because the violations might be something that Hamas doesn't actually have the capacity to enforce. So we'll just have to wait and see. It's a very live issue. The one big thing from an Iran perspective is that interference from Iran is very limited now. Now that this has been reached. So,
yeah, gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Given the de-icing of the Arctic sea lanes and their possible use of the Arctic for data centers, what do you think the U.S. policy is likely to be on Arctic referenda and other developments in there?
That's interesting. That's actually a question that I think both Aaron and Sandy might have something to say about. Aaron, do you want to start?
Sure. I certainly think that the Arctic is a place where there will be continued attention and perhaps some of the most continuity between Biden and Trump in climate policies, at least in terms of national security attention to the region. I think there's been, the release and development of new Arctic strategies as required by Congress in the past couple of years. I would expect, again, because of the Senator Sullivan and Senator Murkowski in Alaska, that again, there will be continuity. I think with the accession to NATO of 2 new Arctic countries and now Russia feeling on the back foot in many ways in the region, I think the risk of inadvertent, accidents leading to greater conflict or tension in the region are higher. I think also China's increased role in the region and their use of gray zone operations, right, just makes the risk of something, nothing intentional necessarily, but an accident spiraling into conflict or risk there. I don't have high hopes that renewed cooperation with Russia through the Arctic Council and in terms of scientific exploration is on the horizon anytime soon. I think we're looking at a region of higher tension going forward, and I think it's a serious concern.
Sandy, what do you think about that, especially with the Russia angle?
Yeah, well, I agree with all that, and it's very helpful. A lot of good information there that I didn't know about. But I think that what worries me the most as a Russia watcher is the potential for deliberate destruction of critical infrastructure. What we've already been seeing with the cutting of pipelines and cables,
Like the undersea cables, the data cables.
and I don't see us having a real strategy for countering this, but at least it now is on everybody's radar, and hopefully looks like the new NATO Secretary General is going to make this a priority to kind of get NATO more united on how to deal with this. And the Finns have been very helpful. Just bring in these formerly neutral countries who have a much more robust approach to security than many people would have predicted. But the Finns, having detained the ship that's apparently cut the cables, I hope they also confiscated some high-tech equipment that they were using to exploit that. But I don't know anything about that. But clearly, this is going to be a new front in the hybrid war with Russia, and we have to stop playing games with Greenland, and keep our allies together so that we can come up with a coherent strategy.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like the best, if you're worried about this, it doesn't seem like the best thing to do to kind of threaten to essentially seize the territory of one of your main allies.
And all these billionaires that Trump is gathering together, they can maybe come up with some good investment strategy that would be a win-win.
Yeah, although I should point out, I read in the Times the other day that the way that the authorities in Greenland have reacted to this is to say, okay, look, like we're not for sale, but actually we do want to.
But we're open for business.
Yeah, I mean, so I want to say that sometimes we see these outlandish, things Trump does and says these kind of outlandish things, but then you see the response, and I'll just speak personally. I'll say, oh gosh, I'm actually, that's a good response. I wish in a way that this kind of conduct did not produce that constructive response, because it seems to only incentivize further outrageous stuff. But sometimes it works, whether you kind of like it or not. I'm not saying all the time, I'm not making a blanket defense of it, but I was a little bit surprised to see that there was a kind of potentially constructive response there.
Yeah. Just like Trump takes credit for increased defense spending.
Right, on the part of NATO allies, right. Well, I mean, what do you think that he doesn't deserve any credit?
No, I hate to say it, but he deserves a lot of credit.
Right.
But I think the Europeans now have to kind of seize an opportunity to raise the level of their game. And, they have the resources if they make the political decisions to go beyond the 2% of GDP to some higher level, and to create a kind of a different division of labor that allows the U.S. to deal more with Asian scenarios, and everybody, will gain, and Trump can maybe look for some other pastors to spoil the pastoral
Right.
situation.
Okay, we had a question, a gentleman here.
Thank you. My question is about the work visa, which is basically a conduit for attracting talents from all over the world, a tremendous implication on inflation and our economic innovation. And it seems now the Trump administration has two opposing views regarding migrant workers. Yeah, at the high end, I mean, but please comment on both high end, also on the ordinary service migrant workers.
Okay, so I just want to understand your question a little bit better. You're trying to figure out it's an immigration question about high skilled workers versus okay. Well, here's what I'll do. I'm going to kick that actually first to Sasha, because that's the tech industry is where we've seen this there's a little bit of a struggle in Trump world about H-1B visas. Elon Musk is on one side of it and Steve Bannon is on the other side of it. I'm kind of curious from where you said, I mean, you're in DC now, but more broadly, if you're in Silicon Valley, not necessarily geographically, but substantively, what do you expect? I mean, which faction here do you expect to win, and what will determine that?
Well, I'm taking no bets on factions.
Right. Okay.
I find that making those kinds of predictions usually ends in embarrassment. Nor am I an immigration expert, really, so I can only tell you, from my perspective. Look, we are a multicultural company. We have researchers, including some of our most senior and some of the best researchers in the world at OpenAI that come from all over the world. A lot of them are American, but not all of them. I think we have greatly benefited as a company. I suspect most of our peers would say the same thing, from the fact that we are able to attract the best talent from across the world, and that people want to come to this country and to live in this country and work in this country because of both the types of work that they're able to do at a company like OpenAI, but also because of the opportunity that the United States as a whole presents, right? And I'm the daughter of refugees. And so, I am acutely sort of sensitive to that desire. On the other hand, we are, and this is something that our executive leadership is very upfront about. We're an American company. And so when you think about, for example, competition between the PRC and the United States, our product is not available in China. And our executives have been very clear that we are trying to develop democratic AI to benefit democratic governments, led by the United States, but together with sort of democratically aligned allies and partners. We've taken a pretty clear position on that, and that's something that we're proud of. So, look, I think this is something where a lot of times the back and forth on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now can be very hyperbolic. I suspect that there are probably technical adjustments to some of these programs, visa programs or others, that might actually be good common sense ideas. Again, not my area of expertise, so I don't know. I think some of that, though, knowledge from actual experts is getting lost in a lot of churn that that's kind of fomented on social media in a way that's not productive. So I hope that the incoming team, they control all of the levers of government. I hope that they can kind of get their act together to sort through this and do it in a sort of technocratic way.
Yeah, I will hazard a little bit of a guess. I'm going to use my moderator prerogative. The other part of your question, I think, has to do with what we might call lower skilled immigration or kind of the border crisis. I think what Sasha's saying, if I read you correctly, is that there are a lot of private sector incentives to not restrict skilled, the best workers, the best talent. It's this challenge for AI. On the border, I think what everyone might want to think about is whether Trump may find a way to do what I would call Potemkin mass deportations, right? He's promised mass deportations. What I think our media environment might allow for, unfortunately, is actually a relatively small scale, horrible for the people involved who are targeted and who are sent away and her families who are separated, but actually a very small number, but enough so that he can say, look what I did. Look at these, look at the deportations I did. Look at the pain I caused our enemies. Look at the, I did it, it's done. And then on the other side, he can make whatever deals he has to make with that. I think that's the kind of thing you're going to see across the board, not just immigration. That's just my playing pundit for a second. That's what I expect. Yes, the young lady here.
Hi, I'm Samantha Bradshaw, a Perry Worldhouse Lightning Scholar. I have a question for you, Sasha. I'm really interested to know what you think the Trump administration is going to do around issues of platform governance, disinformation, and freedom of speech, and the kinds of implications these actions might have on democracy here in this country and also around the world.
Yeah.
Great question.
It's a great question. I'm really gratified that you all think I know what the Trump administration is going to do. I can tell you that anyone who tells you that they think they know the answer to that question is maybe overconfident. But reading the tea leaves, I mean, I think writ large, you look at the conversation that's happening amongst Republicans. I would expect to see some of the sort of guardrails and brakes around some of this stuff come off. I mean, Ted Cruz, who is in a very influential position in the Commerce Committee, has made this one of his sort of causes over the past couple of years. I think you see some language like this coming out of the Trump administration. So, I think they, to the extent that there is a balancing act between freedom of speech and sort of content guidelines around inflammatory language, et cetera, things like that, you will see them veering in the direction of more freedom of speech and fewer guidelines. I think, we've already seen Meta publicly announce that they are moving in that direction. That's something that Elon Musk has made one of the sort of key characteristics of his platform, both X and XAI, which is his AI company. Where the rest of the industry goes, I don't know. It's a little bit outside of my purview. The guidelines that I spend a lot of time talking about and thinking about and what keeps me up at night are actually more on the national security side of the house. Not that disinformation, misinformation isn't a national security issue, but like I spend a lot of time worrying about, can we be certain that our models are not going to respond to terrorists or other people with sort of malign intent who want to create, let's say, a chemical weapon or a bioweapon or something like that. So there's a spectrum of guardrails on these things, and I tend to focus more on sort of that side of things. But generally speaking, I think the trend, at least over the next couple of years, is going to be to move towards fewer restrictions on speech and sort of more absolutist freedom of speech protections. What that means for our democracy, I'm not sure. I think, in some ways, this is a little bit of an experiment that we're all going to live through together.
I have to admit, the prospect of a jihadi prompter was not something I had ever really considered before, but I think that's probably something that we ought to worry about.
I don't mean to give you all nightmares, but welcome to my world.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. What a world. Young man in the back here.
Yeah, so it seems like we've been talking a lot about how Silicon Valley has had growing influence in the White House with regards to AI. I'm curious about how that might pertain to the climate change and the climate crisis generally, because from my perspective, it seems like those in Silicon Valley are a bit more like tuned into the issues, both being like technologists, scientists, and also, I guess also with California right now.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think you'll certainly see, I think there's a Silicon Valley interest in techno-optimist solutions to climate change, right? And investments in things that can help manage climate emissions and climate risks. I think you'll see an increased interest in geoengineering, for example, solar radiation management, cloud seeding, things like that. You'll have people in positions in Washington and government who are more interested in pursuing those avenues. What I worry about with that, though, frankly, is a lot of the security risks we see from climate change are not just because of the emissions themselves, but it's how societies and how governments react, right? And it's how those climate hazards intersect with other things like instability, like exclusionary institutions, right? All of these things that create conflict and instability risk in places like Syria or in Yemen or in Somalia, right? And that I don't think is going to be solved by Silicon Valley and by technology, frankly. And so a lot of the things we need to do to build resilience and build adaptation, those are left out of the picture. So, this is perhaps a dismissive word, but I could expect seeing a lot of widgets, right? Like new, cool, shiny objects that we might want to pursue, carbon capture, right? Other things like that. But really solving the security dynamics of climate, I'm less optimistic.
It's interesting because you'd think that the contracting opportunities would be in the infrastructural changes and the stuff to do with resilience and adaptations.
Yeah, no, but I think part of resilience and adaptation, right, isn't physical things, but it's societal trust. It's trust in government and information, right? I mean, when you have leaders, launching disinformation campaigns about climate hazards themselves, that harms your ability to address the crisis. And
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Less of a private sector motive there. Yeah, fair. Okay. I think we probably have time for one more. The gentleman here.
Thank you. My name's Steve Leach. I suppose I should say, I think I came here on an L1 visa. Anyway, my question, how does Trump's sort of nationalist approach to foreign policy, his views on Ukraine and how that should be handled, his strongman views, how does that impact China's decision if and when to invade Taiwan? Thank you.
Okay, that's a big one. Sandy, I'm gonna throw that one to you because you know about strongmen and strongmen rationale and logic.
Yeah.
But that's a good question. We don't have a China expert here, but I think it's more about the Trump.
I think it's a point that many experts make, that the Russians are watching very carefully how vigorously or not so vigorously the West responds to,
Or how the Chinese are watching carefully, rather.
yeah, the Chinese, excuse me. There's a sense that if Putin appears to have won or at least made significant gains, this will embolden the Chinese to bring forward their supposedly planned decision to resolve the Taiwan issue, including by force. So I think in making the case why it's important not to abandon Ukraine, it ultimately is about China. If Ukraine is abandoned, there might be a lull, but the conflict will continue, and the Chinese will be much more bold about settling scores by force if they can't do it through intimidation and hybrid warfare.
Do you think the Chinese have already sort of seen what's happened in terms of in Ukraine and Russian kind of overconfidence? Has that already affected their calculus, do you think? It's hard to know.
Well, I think they've seen, for example, how the Russians have been able to kind of deter President Biden and his administration from really pulling out all the stops in terms of military aid to Ukraine. And that would be a lesson that they would learn as they think about ways to build up pressure on Taiwan at some point when they decide it's ripe for resolution. Now, there may be ways we can engage with the Chinese and steer them away from that, but I think the main test is, can we actually prevent Ukraine from being transformed into a totally subjugated nation under Russian domination, and even ceasing to exist as a sovereign state, which is a popular topic just in the last couple of days. Nikolai Patrushev used to be the head of their Security Council, predicted that Ukraine will cease to exist as a state in 2025. So, watch this space.
Did he give it an 85% chance? Let me just add one last thought to your question that I think might be a good thing to close on. I think it's an excellent question, and I appreciate Sandy's Sandy's answer. I do think when we're having a conversation like this focused on what are the priorities for the next administration, what's President Trump going to do, it's always important to also keep in mind that decision makers elsewhere, whether it's President Xi or Putin, have their own political calculus, their own domestic systems, their own set of incentives. They're not, in fact, always reacting to what the Americans do or what's happening here. And I think it's just, we can lose sight of that. I myself lose sight of that sometimes, just sitting where I sit. So I think it's something to always remember. But that said, it's going to be a consequential administration. We're going to see some consequential decisions. Thank you all so much. I think you've shed a lot of light on this, a lot of insight and information. Thank you all, and thank you to our audience as well. And thank you to Perry House.